June 8, 793 AD. The monks of Lindisfarne Abbey are preparing for morning prayers. They have no idea that the world is about to change forever. Lindisfarne is a holy island off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, connected to the mainland only at low tide. For 2 centuries, it's been a beacon of Christianity in a pagan world, a monastery filled with illuminated manuscripts, golden chalices, jeweled crosses, and men who've devoted their lives to God. It's peaceful here, safe. The monks have no weapons, no walls strong enough to matter, no reason to fear. War is something that happens elsewhere, between kings and armies. Not here, never here. Brother Ethelred is crossing the courtyard when he hears it, a sound like nothing he's ever heard before. A rhythmic splashing, growing louder. He looks toward the sea, and his blood turns to ice. Ships, dozens of them, cutting through the morning mist like knives, their dragon-headed prows rising and falling with each stroke of the oars. They're moving impossibly fast, riding the waves as if the sea itself is pushing them toward shore. The ships are sleek, elegant, terrifying, built for speed and shallow water, able to beach directly on the sand. Warriors stand at the rails, their shields painted in bright colors, their axes and swords catching the early morning light. The monks freeze. Some run. Most simply stand there, unable to comprehend what's happening. These men have spent their lives in prayer and contemplation. They've never seen war. They've never seen Vikings. The raiders hit the beach at a full sprint. They don't hesitate, don't negotiate, don't demand surrender. They simply attack. Axes rise and fall. Monks who try to flee are cut down. Those who try to hide are dragged out. The abbey is ransacked, golden crosses torn from walls, jeweled reliquaries smashed open, illuminated manuscripts ripped apart for their precious metal bindings. The altar itself is desecrated, the sacred vessel stolen, the wine drunk by laughing warriors who mock the Christian God while blood pools on the stone floor. By midday, it's over. The Vikings load their ships with treasure, take the youngest and strongest monks as slaves, and sail away as quickly as they came. Behind them, Lindisfarne burns. The smoke can be seen for miles, a black column rising into the sky like a funeral pyre for an age of innocence that has just died. News of the raid spreads across Europe like wildfire. A scholar named Alcuin, serving at Charlemagne's court in France, writes in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. The Viking age has begun. For the next 273 years, these warriors from the north will terrorize, transform, and ultimately reshape the medieval world. They will raid from Ireland to Constantinople. They will establish kingdoms in England, France, and Russia. They will discover Iceland, colonize Greenland, and reach North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They will be remembered as the most feared warriors of their age. But they were so much more than that. This is their story, not the myth, not the legend, the truth. ACT 1. Origins to understand why the Vikings exploded onto the world stage in 793 AD. You have to understand where they came from. And Scandinavia in the 8th century was a world that forged warriors out of necessity. Picture the landscape: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, lands of impossible beauty and brutal harshness. Mountains that scrape the sky, their peaks white with eternal snow. Fjords that cut deep into the coastline like the earth itself has been cleaved by giant axes. Forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrates to the ground. And winters that last for months, where the sun barely rises, where temperatures plummet so low that exposed skin freezes in minutes, where survival itself is a daily battle. The people who lived here were shaped by this environment. They had to be tough, resourceful, adaptable. Farming was possible only in the short summer months, and even then, the rocky soil and short growing season meant food was always scarce. Families lived in longhouses, rectangular wooden buildings with turf roofs, where humans and animals sheltered together for warmth. They ate fish, barley, oats, and whatever meat they could hunt or raise. They wore wool and fur. They burned peat and wood to stay warm. They survived. But survival wasn't enough. Norse culture valued something more than mere existence. They valued fame, reputation, glory. They believed that a man's deeds would outlive his body, that stories told about you after death were the only true immortality. The Norse had a word for this, drengskap, the quality of being a good, honorable, brave person whose name would be remembered in the sagas. To die forgotten was the worst fate imaginable. To die in battle, to be remembered in song, that was worth any risk. The Norse gods reflected this worldview. Odin, the All-Father, was a god of wisdom, poetry, and war, but also of cunning, deception, and sacrifice. He gave up his eye for knowledge, hung himself on the world tree for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes. Thor, the thunder god, was a warrior who defended the gods and humans from giants and monsters, wielding his hammer Mjolnir to protect the ordered world from chaos. Freya was the goddess of love, fertility, and war. She claimed half of those who died in battle for her hall, while Odin took the other half to Valhalla. Valhalla, the hall of the slain. This was the Norse heaven, not a place of peace and rest, but an eternal warrior's paradise where the bravest fighters who died in battle would feast and fight forever, preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world when the gods themselves would die fighting the forces of chaos. To die in bed of old age or sickness meant going to hell, the underworld, a cold, miserable place of shadows. But to die with a sword in your hand meant Valhalla, meant glory, meant immortality. So you had a culture that valued courage, fame, and glorious death, living in an environment where resources were scarce and survival was hard. You had a religion that promised eternal glory to warriors. You had a social structure based on personal honor and reputation. And you had a tradition of seafaring, because in Scandinavia, with its countless islands, fjords, and coastal settlements, the sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. The Norse had been building boats for centuries, small fishing vessels, coastal traders, ferries. But in the late 8th century, they perfected a design that would change history, the longship. The Viking longship was a technological marvel, a perfect fusion of form and function that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Picture a vessel 70 feet long, 16 feet wide, built from overlapping oak planks that flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. A single mast with a square sail that could catch the wind, but also oar-ports along each side where 30 or 40 warriors could row when the wind failed. A shallow draft, drawing only 3 feet of water, that allowed the ship to navigate rivers, beach on any shore, and escape into shallows where larger vessels couldn't follow. The ships were beautiful. The prow and stern curved upward, often carved into dragon heads or serpent shapes that were meant to frighten enemies and ward off evil spirits. The shields of the crew were mounted along the rails, overlapping in bright colors: red, yellow, blue, white. The sail might be striped or decorated with symbols. When a fleet of longships appeared on the horizon, dragon heads cutting through the waves, shields gleaming, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm, it must have looked like something from mythology. Like the gods themselves were coming to war. And they were fast. A longship under sail could make 15 knots, faster than any other vessel of the age. They could cross the North Sea from Norway to England in 2 days if the wind was favorable. They could sail up rivers deep into the heart of enemy territory raid, and be gone before any army could respond. They were the stealth bombers of the medieval world, impossible to predict, impossible to catch, devastating in their strikes. But why did the Vikings start raiding in the first place? Why 793? Why Lindisfarne? The answer is complex, a perfect storm of environmental, economic, technological, and cultural factors. First, climate change. The medieval warm period was beginning, and while that might sound good, in Scandinavia it meant unpredictable weather, failed harvests, and population pressure. Families were growing, but the amount of farmable land wasn't. The traditional solution, splitting the farm between sons, meant each generation had less land. Younger sons faced a choice: stay home and be poor or seek fortune elsewhere. Second, primogeniture. In Norse society, the eldest son typically inherited the farm. Younger sons got nothing. This created a surplus of young men, trained in warfare, ambitious, with nothing to lose and everything to gain. They needed wealth to buy land, to attract wives, to establish themselves. Raiding offered a solution. Third, the wealth of Christian Europe. The Vikings knew about the lands to the south. Traders had been traveling between Scandinavia and Christian Europe for generations. They knew about the monasteries, knew these were repositories of incredible wealth, knew they were largely undefended. Why were they undefended? Because Christian Europe had been relatively peaceful for generations. The fall of Rome was centuries in the past. The major kingdoms, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, fought each other occasionally, but monasteries were considered sacred, off-limits. No Christian would attack a monastery. The Vikings weren't Christians. To them, a monastery was just a poorly defended warehouse full of gold. Fourth, the longship. Before the perfection of the longship design, raiding across the North Sea was too risky, too slow, too vulnerable. But with the longship, suddenly England, Ireland, and France were only days away. Suddenly you could strike and be gone before anyone could respond. The longship didn't just enable Viking raids, it made them inevitable. And fifth, culture. Remember, the Norse valued fame, glory, adventure. They believed that a life of comfort and safety was worthless compared to a life of great deeds. They had a concept called Viking, which was actually a verb, not a noun. To go Viking meant to go on an adventure, a raid, a journey seeking fortune and fame. The men who did this, the Vikinger, were admired, respected, celebrated in songs and stories. So you had environmental pressure, economic need, technological capability, cultural values, and vulnerable targets. Lindisfarne wasn't an aberration. It was inevitable. The only question was when. After Lindisfarne, the raids continued. The next year, Vikings hit the monasteries at Jarrow and Monkwearmouth in Northumbria, then Ireland, then Scotland, then the coast of France. At first, these were small-scale raids, a few ships, quick strikes, grab the treasure, and leave. But the Vikings quickly learned something important. Nobody could stop them. The kingdoms of England, Ireland, and France were fragmented, constantly fighting each other, unable to coordinate a defense. By the time word of a raid reached a king, by the time he could assemble an army, the Vikings were long gone. And the loot, the gold, the silver, the slaves, the weapons, when the raiders returned home, they were heroes. They had wealth. They had stories. They had fame. More men wanted to go Viking. The raids grew larger, more ambitious, more devastating. And within a few decades, raiding wouldn't be enough. The Vikings would come not just to steal, but to conquer. ACT 2. The Viking Age explodes. By the 830s and 840s. Viking raids had evolved from hit-and-run attacks into sustained campaigns. Fleets of dozens or even hundreds of ships would arrive, establish fortified camps, and spend entire seasons raiding the countryside. They learned to exploit the political divisions of their enemies. When English kingdoms fought each other, the Vikings played them against each other. When Frankish nobles feuded, the Vikings offered their services as mercenaries to the highest bidder, and then raided everyone anyway. Ireland suffered terribly. The Vikings established permanent bases at Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, turning them from Viking camps into thriving trade cities. They raided the great monasteries, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Armagh, stripping them of treasures accumulated over centuries. Irish chronicles from this period are filled with anguish. The sea spewed forth floods of foreigners over Ireland, so that no haven, no landing place, no stronghold, no fort, no castle might be found, but it was submerged by waves of Vikings and pirates. France faced similar devastation. The Vikings sailed up the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, rivers that cut deep into the heart of Francia. In 845, a fleet led by a chieftain named Ragnar, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, though historians debate whether he was one man or several combined in legend, sailed up the Seine with 120 ships and attacked Paris itself. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, couldn't defeat them, so he paid them 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. The Vikings took the money and left. Then they came back the next year, and the year after that. The Franks had accidentally taught the Vikings that you could get paid for not raiding. Danegeld, protection money, became a regular source of Viking income. Why risk battle when kings would pay you to go away? But England would face the greatest Viking threat of all. In 865 AD, something unprecedented happened. Instead of scattered raiding parties, a massive Viking army landed in East Anglia. Thousands of warriors from Denmark and Norway, organized under multiple commanders, bringing horses, supplies, and siege equipment. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called them the Great Heathen Army, and they came not to raid, but to conquer. The Great Heathen Army was allegedly led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ub, seeking revenge for their father's death. According to legend, Ragnar had been captured by King El of Northumbria and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, where he died singing songs of his great deeds. Whether that's true or not, the army that arrived in 865 was real, and it was unstoppable. They moved through England like a scythe through wheat. East Anglia fell first. King Edmund was captured, allegedly tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, and beheaded when he refused to renounce Christianity. Northumbria fell next. York, the great city of northern England, became the Viking capital of Jorvik. Mercia, the powerful Midland kingdom, was defeated and its king driven into exile. By 870, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Only Wessex remained, ruled by a young king named Alfred, who had earned the epithet the Great. Alfred fought a desperate guerrilla war, retreating into the marshes of Somerset, hiding in the wilderness while the Vikings occupied his kingdom. The story goes that Alfred, in disguise, took shelter in a peasant woman's cottage and was tasked with watching some cakes baking by the fire. Lost in thought about how to save his kingdom, he let the cakes burn, and the woman berated him, not knowing she was scolding a king. Whether that story is true or not, what is true is that Alfred survived, rebuilt his army, and in 878 at the Battle of Edington, he defeated the Great Heathen Army and forced their leader, Guthrum, to accept baptism and peace terms. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England roughly in half. The southwest and west would remain Anglo-Saxon, ruled by Alfred from his capital at Winchester. The north and east, roughly everything north and east of the old Roman road called Watling Street, would be Viking territory, governed by Danish law. The Danelaw, they called it. For the next century, England would be split between 2 cultures, 2 religions, 2 ways of life. But Alfred had saved Anglo-Saxon England. He fortified towns, built a navy, reformed the army, promoted learning and literacy, and established a system of law that would influence England for centuries. When he died in 899, his kingdom was secure, and his descendants would eventually reconquer the Danelaw and unite England under one crown. But while some Vikings were conquering England, others were sailing in completely different directions, toward destinations that would change the map of Europe forever. While Danish and Norwegian Vikings sailed west, Swedish Vikings, called the Russ, sailed east and south, down the rivers of what is now Russia. They weren't primarily raiders. They were traders, adventurers, explorers seeking the legendary riches of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. The rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, were highways into a vast, barely mapped world. The Russ built their longships smaller and lighter than their western cousins, designed to be portaged overland between river systems. They would sail down a river until it ended, carry their ships overland to another river, and continue. It was backbreaking work, but it opened trade routes stretching thousands of miles. The Russ established trading posts that would become great cities. Novgorod, on the Fokhov River, became a center of commerce where furs, slaves, amber, and honey from the north were traded for silk, spices, silver, and weapons from the south. Kiev, on the Dnieper, grew into a powerful city-state that controlled the river trade route to the Black Sea and Constantinople. The Rus gave their name to the region, Russia, and their descendants would found the Russian state. In 860, a Rus fleet of 200 ships attacked Constantinople itself, the greatest city in the Christian world, capital of the Byzantine Empire, protected by massive walls and Greek fire. The attack failed, but it announced to the Byzantines that these northern warriors were a force to be reckoned with. Eventually, the Byzantines decided that if they couldn't defeat the Rus, they would hire them. The Varangian Guard was formed, an elite unit of Viking warriors who served as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor. To serve in the Varangian Guard was the height of prestige for a Norse warrior. You would see Constantinople, the queen of cities, with its Hagia Sophia Cathedral, its palaces, its markets filled with goods from across the known world. You would be paid in Byzantine gold. You would fight in legendary campaigns. And when you returned home, if you returned home, you would be wealthy and famous. One of the most famous Varangians was Harald Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, who would play a crucial role at the very end of the Viking Age. But that story comes later. The Rus weren't the only Vikings sailing to unexpected destinations. While some sought the riches of the East, others sought something different: land. Empty land, freedom, a place to build a new life away from the crowded fjords of Norway. In the 870s, Norwegian Vikings began settling Iceland, a massive island of volcanoes, glaciers, and geothermal springs that had been uninhabited except for a handful of Irish monks. The settlement of Iceland was different from the raids and conquests happening elsewhere. These weren't warriors seeking plunder. They were farmers, families, people seeking a fresh start. The settlers brought everything they needed: livestock, tools, seeds, timber, and established farms in the coastal valleys where the land was fertile enough to graze sheep and grow barley. Iceland had no king, no central authority. Instead, the settlers created the Althing, a general assembly where all free men could gather once a year to settle disputes, pass laws, and make collective decisions. It was one of the earliest forms of democratic government in Europe, and it still exists today, making Iceland's parliament the oldest continuously functioning legislative assembly in the world. Life in Iceland was hard but free. The settlers told stories, sagas, that preserved their history, their genealogies, their feuds and friendships. The sagas were eventually written down, and they give us an incredibly detailed picture of Viking life. How they farmed, how they resolved disputes, how they viewed honor and revenge, how women could own property and demand divorces, how families feuded for generations over insults and murders. Imagine a winter evening in an Icelandic longhouse. Outside, the wind howls and snow piles against the walls. Inside, a fire burns in the central hearth, smoke drifting up through a hole in the turf roof. Families gather on benches along the walls, wrapped in wool and fur. Someone passes a horn of mead, and a skald, a poet, begins to recite a saga, his voice rising and falling in the ancient rhythms, telling stories of gods and heroes, of voyages and battles, of ancestors and their great deeds. This was how the Vikings remembered. This was how they preserved their history. Not in written books, most Vikings couldn't read, but in spoken word, in poetry and song, in stories passed from generation to generation. The sagas were their immortality. But some Vikings wouldn't settle for Iceland. Some wanted to go even farther. ACT3, the New World in 982 AD, a man named Eric Thorvaldsson, known as Eric the Red because of his fiery red hair and violent temper, was exiled from Iceland for 3 years after killing several men in a feud. Exile was a serious punishment in Norse society, but Eric saw it as an opportunity. He'd heard rumors of land to the west, glimpsed occasionally by ships blown off course. He decided to find it. Eric sailed west into the unknown, and after days at sea, he sighted a massive coastline of mountains, glaciers, and, in the sheltered fjords of the southwest, green valleys with grass and low shrubs. Eric spent 3 years exploring this new land, and when his exile ended, he returned to Iceland with stories of a place he called Greenland, a marketing ploy historians believe, to make it sound more attractive to potential settlers. In 985, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships carrying colonists to Greenland. Only 14 ships made it. The Atlantic is merciless, and storms claimed the rest. But those who survived established 2 settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, building farms in the fjords, raising sheep and cattle, hunting seals and caribou. The Greenland colony would survive for nearly 500 years before mysteriously disappearing, probably due to climate change. But in the late 10th century, it was thriving. And it was from Greenland that Vikings would take the final, incredible step. Around the year 1000 AD, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland when his ship was blown off course by a storm. For days, he sailed through fog and uncertainty until the weather cleared and he saw land. But it wasn't Greenland. This land was flat, heavily forested. Nothing like the rocky coast he expected. Bjarni didn't land. He was anxious to reach his destination, but he sailed along the coast for a while before finding his way to Greenland. When Bjarni told his story, most people thought he was foolish for not exploring this new land. But one young man listened with intense interest. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Leif was a born explorer, restless and ambitious, eager to make a name for himself separate from his famous father. He bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and around the year 1000 AD, he sailed west into the unknown. Imagine what that journey must have felt like. Leaving the safety of Greenland's coast, sailing into the vast, empty Atlantic with no guarantee of finding anything. No maps, no compass, navigating by the sun and stars and the flight of birds. Days pass. The ocean is gray and endless. The crew grows nervous. Did Bjarni really see land, or was it a trick of the fog? Should they turn back? And then land. The first land Leif saw was flat and rocky, covered with stone slabs. He called it Helluland, Slabland, probably Baffin Island in northern Canada. They didn't stay. Leif sailed south, and the next land they found was flat and forested, with white sandy beaches. He called it Markland, forest land, probably Labrador. Still they sailed south. And then they found it. A land of green meadows, forests, rivers teeming with salmon. The climate was mild, much warmer than Greenland. Wild grapes grew in abundance, so Leif called the land Vinland, wine land. They'd reached North America, probably the northern tip of Newfoundland, around the year 1000 AD. Vikings reached America 500 years before Columbus. 500 years before Europeans discovered the New World. This isn't legend. This isn't myth. This is historical fact, confirmed by archaeology. Leif and his crew built a settlement, large turf houses, workshops, a forge for working iron. They spent the winter there, exploring the coast, gathering timber to bring back to treeless Greenland, marveling at this rich, abundant land. In the spring, they loaded their ship with timber and grapes and sailed home to Greenland as heroes. Leif Erikson had discovered a new world. Other expeditions followed. Leif's brother Thorvald led a voyage to Vinland, but was killed in a fight with indigenous people. The Norse called them Skrælings, a derogatory term meaning wretches or barbarians. Another expedition, led by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, brought 60 or 70 colonists, including women, with the intention of establishing a permanent settlement. They stayed for 3 years, and Karlsefni's wife, Gudrid, gave birth to a son named Snorri, the first European child born in the Americas. But the settlement didn't last. The sagas tell us why. The Vikings and the indigenous peoples, probably ancestors of the Mi'kmaq or Beothuk people, initially traded peacefully. The Norse offered cloth and milk in exchange for furs and other goods. But tensions rose. Cultural misunderstandings led to violence. The indigenous peoples vastly outnumbered the Vikings, knew the land intimately, and were skilled warriors. The Vikings, far from home and any reinforcement, realized they couldn't hold the territory. There was also internal conflict. The sagas mention feuds among the Vikings themselves, fights over women and resources. And Vinland, while rich, was simply too far from Greenland and Iceland. The journey was dangerous. Supply lines were impossible to maintain. The land was occupied by people who didn't want them there. After a few years, the Vikings abandoned Vinland. Some may have returned for timber in later years. Greenland desperately needed wood, but permanent settlement was given up. The Norse colony in Greenland survived until the 15th century, but Vinland faded into legend, remembered in the sagas, but not believed by most Europeans. In 1960, archaeologist Helga and Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Turf buildings, iron nails, a bronze pin, a spindle whorl for spinning wool. The discovery proved beyond doubt that Vikings had reached North America around the year 1000 AD. What if they had stayed? What if Leif Erikson's colony had survived? What if Vikings had colonized North America 500 years before Columbus? How would history have changed? We'll never know. The Vikings came, stayed briefly, and left. But for that short time, they achieved something extraordinary. They crossed the Atlantic, discovered a new world, and proved that the ocean wasn't an impassable barrier, but a highway to adventure. That was the Viking spirit. Not just to raid, not just to conquer, but to explore, to see what lay beyond the horizon, to sail into the unknown, because the unknown was where fame and glory waited. ACT 4. Transformation while Leif Erikson was exploring Vinland. The Vikings in Europe were undergoing a transformation. They were no longer just raiders. They were becoming rulers, integrating into the very kingdoms they'd once terrorized. The most dramatic example was Rollo, a Norwegian chieftain who led devastating raids along the Seine River in France. In 911, King Charles the Simple of Francia faced a problem. He couldn't defeat Rollo, but he couldn't afford to keep paying him to leave. So Charles made an extraordinary offer. He would give Rollo a huge territory along the northern coast of France, the land around the mouth of the Seine, if Rollo would convert to Christianity, swear fealty to the king, and defend Francia from other Vikings. Rollo accepted. He was baptized, married Charles's daughter, and became the first Duke of Normandy. Normandy meaning land of the Northmen. According to legend, when Rollo was supposed to kiss King Charles's foot as a sign of submission, he refused and ordered one of his men to do it instead. The man grabbed the king's foot and lifted it to his mouth, causing Charles to fall over backward. A final act of Viking defiance, even in submission. Rollo and his Vikings settled in Normandy, married French women, adopted French language and customs, and within a few generations, they were more French than Norse. But they retained their martial prowess, their ambition, their hunger for expansion. In 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Bastard, better known as William the Conqueror, would invade England and become its king. The Norman conquest of 1066 was, in a sense, the final Viking conquest of England. But by then, the conquerors spoke French, practiced Christianity, and thought of themselves as Normans rather than Vikings. The same transformation was happening across Scandinavia itself. Christian missionaries had been working in the north for decades, often with limited success. The Norse gods were deeply embedded in the culture, and many Vikings saw Christianity as a religion for weaklings who feared death. But gradually, through a combination of missionary work, political pressure, and the practical advantages of joining Christian Europe's trade networks and diplomatic systems, the Scandinavian kingdoms converted. Denmark's King Harald Bluetooth converted around 960 AD and declared Denmark a Christian kingdom. Norway's King Olaf Tryggvason converted around 995 and used a combination of persuasion and violence to convert his people. He would offer jarls and chieftains a choice: baptism or death. Many chose baptism. Sweden converted more slowly, with Christianity and paganism coexisting for decades. But by the early 12th century, Sweden too was officially Christian. The conversion of Scandinavia marked the end of the Viking Age as much as any military defeat. Christianity brought new values: forgiveness instead of revenge, humility instead of pride, eternal life in heaven instead of Valhalla. The warrior culture that had driven Viking expansion was incompatible with Christian teaching. Young men were encouraged to become monks or merchants instead of raiders. The sagas were written down by Christian scribes who preserved the old stories, but also added Christian morals and lessons. The Vikings were transforming, integrating, becoming part of the European kingdoms they'd once terrorized. They built churches instead of burning them. They traded instead of raiding. They farmed instead of plundering. The dragon-headed longships were pulled ashore for the last time, left to rot or be broken up for timber. The age of the Vikings was ending. The last great Viking invasion of England came in 1066, a year that would change English history forever, though not in the way the Vikings intended. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was the embodiment of the old Viking spirit. He'd spent his youth as a mercenary in the Varangian Guard, fighting across the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean. He'd accumulated enormous wealth, earned a reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his age, and returned to Norway to claim the throne. For 20 years, he'd ruled Norway with an iron fist, constantly fighting to expand his power. In 1066, Harold saw an opportunity. The King of England, Edward the Confessor, had died without an heir, and 3 men claimed the throne: Harold, Godwin's son, who'd been crowned king by the English nobility; William of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the throne; and Harald Hardrada, who had a complicated and dubious claim through previous Danish kings of England. Harald Hardrada assembled a massive invasion force, allegedly 300 ships carrying 10,000 warriors, and sailed for England. He landed in northern England, defeated an English army at the Battle of Fulford, and captured York. It seemed like the great days of Viking conquest had returned. But Harald Hardrada had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd underestimated Harold Godwinson, the English king, who force-marched his army 200 miles north in just 4 days, an incredible feat of speed and endurance. On September 25, 1066, at Stamford Bridge, the English army caught the Vikings by surprise. The battle was brutal. The Vikings, many without their armor because they hadn't expected an attack, fought desperately. According to legend, a single Viking berserker held the bridge alone, killing 40 Englishmen before someone floated under the bridge in a barrel and stabbed him from below. Harald Hardrada himself was killed by an arrow to the throat. His army was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Vikings to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age. It was the last time a Scandinavian king would attempt to conquer England through force. The great age of Viking expansion, which had begun with a raid on Lindisfarne 273 years earlier, had ended on a blood-soaked bridge in northern England. Ironically, just 3 weeks later, William of Normandy, descendant of the Viking Rollo, landed in southern England with his own invasion force. Harold Godwinson, exhausted from the battle at Stamford Bridge, force-marched his army back south and met William at Hastings on October 14, 1066. This time, Harold lost. An arrow struck him in the eye, and he died on the battlefield. William became King of England, and the Norman conquest began. So in a strange twist of history, Vikings did conquer England in 1066, but they were Vikings who'd become French, who fought as Norman knights rather than Norse warriors, who worshipped Christ instead of Odin. The transformation was complete. Back in Scandinavia, the kingdoms were consolidating. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were becoming centralized monarchies with established laws, Christian churches, and feudal systems similar to the rest of Europe. The jarls and chieftains who'd once led independent raids were now vassals of kings. The Thing assemblies still met, but their power was diminishing as royal authority grew stronger. The longships were still built, but now they carried merchants and pilgrims instead of raiders. The skills that had made Vikings feared across Europe, seamanship, navigation, adaptability, were turned to trade. Scandinavian merchants established networks across the Baltic, down the Russian rivers, across the North Sea. They were still travelers, still adventurers, but the age of the raid was over. The last remnant of the Viking Age was the Greenland colony, clinging to existence on the edge of the known world. For centuries, the Greenlanders maintained their Norse identity, raising cattle and sheep in the brief summers, hunting seals and walrus, trading ivory and furs to Norway in exchange for iron and timber. They even maintained Christianity. Archaeologists have found the ruins of churches and a cathedral in Greenland. But the climate was changing. The medieval warm period was ending, replaced by the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter and colder. Sea ice made navigation more difficult. The trade ships from Norway came less frequently, then stopped coming altogether. The Greenland colony was isolated, struggling, dying. The last written record from Greenland dates to 1408, a marriage certificate. After that, silence. When European explorers finally returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found the settlements abandoned, the buildings collapsed, no sign of the Norse colonists. They'd simply vanished. Whether they died of starvation and disease, were killed by Inuit peoples, or abandoned Greenland and sailed away to an unknown fate, we'll never know. The last Vikings had disappeared into history. The legacy of the Viking Age lasted 273 years, from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. But the Vikings' impact on history lasted far longer. Start with language. English is filled with words borrowed from Old Norse, brought by the Vikings who settled in the Danelaw. Common words like sky, egg, cake, knife, husband, window, ugly, wrong, die, take, get, give, all Norse in origin. Even the pronouns they, them, and their come from Old Norse. Every time you speak English, you're speaking a language shaped by Vikings. Place names across England, Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy reveal Viking settlement. Any English town ending in by like Derby or Rugby, Thorpe like Scunthorpe, or Thwaite like Braithwaite is of Norse origin. Dublin, the capital of Ireland, was founded by Vikings. Its name comes from the Irish Dublin, meaning black pool, but the city itself was a Viking creation. Genetically, the Vikings left their mark across Europe and beyond. DNA studies show significant Scandinavian ancestry in populations across England, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Normandy, and even parts of Russia and Ukraine. Millions of people alive today are descended from Vikings, carrying Norse genes passed down through 40 generations. Politically and culturally, the Viking impact was enormous. The Rus Vikings founded the states that would become Russia and Ukraine. The very name Russia comes from Rus. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought Norman French culture to England, fundamentally changing English language, law, and society. Iceland's Althing, founded by Viking settlers, is the world's oldest surviving parliament, a testament to Norse traditions of assembly and collective decision-making. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, and their techniques influenced European shipbuilding for centuries. The clinker-built hull, overlapping planks that flex with the waves, remained the standard method for building wooden ships in Northern Europe well into the modern era. The Vikings proved that the Atlantic could be crossed, that the ocean sea wasn't an impassable barrier, but a highway to new worlds. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he was following in the wake of Leif Erikson, even if he didn't know it. But perhaps the Vikings' greatest legacy is in how they captured the human imagination. The sagas they told around winter fires were eventually written down, preserving stories of heroes and gods, feuds and adventures that still fascinate us today. Egil Saga and Njal Saga, the Saga of the Volsungs, the Prose Edda. These medieval texts preserve a worldview utterly different from Christian Europe, a glimpse into a warrior culture that valued courage, honor, and fame above all else. The modern fascination with Vikings is partly based on myth. The horned helmets that Vikings never actually wore, the image of mindless barbarians that ignores their sophisticated culture, the romanticization of violence that forgets the terror they inflicted. Real Vikings were more complex than the myths. They were brutal raiders who killed monks and enslaved innocents. They were also skilled craftsmen who created beautiful jewelry and intricate carvings. They were traders who established networks spanning from Baghdad to Newfoundland. They were explorers who crossed oceans in open boats. They were poets who valued a well-crafted verse as much as a well-crafted sword. Viking women had rights that would shock medieval Christian Europe. They could own property, demand divorces, inherit wealth, and run households and farms while their husbands were away. Viking society, for all its violence, had a concept of law and justice, with assemblies where disputes were settled through negotiation and compensation rather than simply through violence. Vikings were fastidiously clean by medieval standards, bathing weekly and grooming their hair and beards. Arab travelers who encountered Vikings remarked on their cleanliness and vanity. The Vikings were a people of contradictions, brutal and sophisticated, destructive and creative, terrifying and admirable. They raided monasteries and founded cities. They burned books and created sagas. They were pagans who became Christians, raiders who became rulers, warriors who became merchants. They lived in one of the harshest environments on Earth and turned it into an advantage, building ships that could go anywhere, developing a culture that valued exploration and adventure, creating a reputation that made their name synonymous with terror. For 273 years, they shaped the medieval world through raid and trade, conquest and settlement, exploration and colonization. And then they transformed. They didn't disappear. They became Normans, Russians, English, Irish, French. They integrated into the kingdoms they'd once terrorized, bringing their skills, their genes, their words, their stories. The dragon-headed ships rotted away, but the Vikings themselves lived on in their descendants, in the languages they influenced, in the places they settled, in the stories they told. Today, we remember the Vikings not as they were complex, contradictory, human, but as symbols. Symbols of adventure and exploration, of courage in the face of impossible odds, of the drive to see what lies beyond the horizon. When we dream of sailing to unknown lands, of facing our fears, of making a name that will outlive us, we're dreaming Viking dreams. The archaeologists who excavated Lance Aux Meadows found something remarkable. Evidence that Vikings had reached America 500 years before Columbus, proving that the sagas weren't just stories, but history. That discovery changed how we understand the age of exploration. The Vikings got there first. They crossed the Atlantic in open boats, navigating by sun and stars, braving storms and ice, driven by that restless Norse spirit that refused to accept limits. They didn't stay. They couldn't hold Vinland against the indigenous peoples who'd lived there for thousands of years. But they tried. They sailed into the unknown and discovered a new world. That's the Viking legacy. Not the violence, not the terror, but the courage to leave safety behind and sail toward the horizon, not knowing what you'll find, but knowing that the journey itself is worth the risk. The Viking Age lasted 273 years. But the Vikings themselves, they never really left. They're in our words, our blood, our stories. Every time we dream of sailing beyond the horizon, every time we refuse to surrender to impossible odds, every time we fight for our place in history, the Vikings are there. Not as myths, not as legends, but as a reminder of what humans can achieve when we're brave enough to leave the safety ashore and sail into the unknown. This was their story, the complete history of Vikings, blood, glory, and the New World.